Okay, so I'm having a bit of a Groundhog Day moment around all of this because I finished recording this video already once, and then I converted the video, and then I'm not sure what happened because I uploaded it to YouTube and it was only 6 minutes long. I may post that 6 minutes as, I don't know, it's a blooper reel or something. But here's what I'm going to do. I've completely switched equipment. I'm using different equipment in a different part of the house. We're going to try that, and in the event that this doesn't properly post, that will mean that I have, permanently invalidated myself as some kind of techno-peasant, neo-Luddite. I don't know. I'm not incredibly tech-savvy, but I'm not terrible either, so... Anyway, but what you will get instead is me uploading an hour-long video of me screaming continuously. That's what you'll get if this doesn't work. Hopefully it doesn't come to that. Okay, so, right. Okay, so in the first half we talked about Jung the person, Jung the human, Jung himself, right? And we started to lay the groundwork, particularly sort of getting into his confrontation with the unconscious. In this piece, I want to start to try to lay the groundwork, right, on top of that, of starting to describe his theoretical constructs. Okay, so, again, it's not even deja vu, but there's a Groundhog Day-ness to it because I've done this. But anyway, it's okay, I've done it many times. Okay, so let's start at the start. First off, Jung's hypothesis is psychodynamic. Okay, so Jung's theory is psychodynamic. Well, what do we mean by that? What we mean is that, in a psychodynamic theory, the psyche is deemed to have parts, right? And those parts are dynamic. They exist in a dynamic relationship to each other, right? So, okay, so what does that mean? The way that I typically express this, and those of you who have taken my half course on this subject, Hypotheses of the Unconscious, will already be familiar to some extent with this language. But the term that I often use in this respect is that I say that we are not singular, unified beings, okay? I sometimes also say, this is my term, not Jung's, but I say that we are often prey to the unitive bias, okay? And what's the unitive bias? Well, essentially speaking, that's a way of saying that we're used to thinking of ourselves as single persons, right? I'm Anderson. Of course I'm Anderson. Who else would I be? And, historically speaking, right, we have often not just seen ourselves in terms of being a singular unified being, right? But also that we have, in some sense, if not perfect, quite good, usually, access to the contents of our own mind, right? So the idea is like our mind is transparent to us, and we have access to the whole thing, and what we experience is what there is, and that's it, right? The psychodynamic hypothesis says instead, no, we are a collection of parts, right? Dynamic parts, so that we are components that are related to each other, right? And so each of those components, right, has important relations, like the organs of the body have important relations that they combine together to create a healthy and functioning psyche that we call ourselves, right? And if you think about it, if this was sort of any other domain, this would be pretty uncontroversial, right? You take it for granted, right, that there are specialized parts in your biology otherwise, right? And that those parts have specialized tasks and specialized functions, and that they, typically speaking, are working together to produce you as a being entire, right? So, and importantly, that those parts may work together, right? That they can work at cross purposes to each other, and that in fact they can be sort of, if not entirely separated because they're in the same body, they can be working just in fully different directions, not interacting all that much, right? It's the same with the parts of your mind. So in a psychodynamic hypothesis, the idea is that there are these subcomponents that compose you and your functionality. But, and this is an important distinction for most psychodynamic theories, and certainly for Jung's, that those parts possess, to some extent, a measure of the same kinds of capacities that make you, as a person, a person. So they possess some degree of consciousness, some degree of intention, some access to memory, right? That they have, in a sense, kind of personalities. They are not quite persons, they're almost like demi-persons, demi-personalities, right? But that there is a significant amount of personness about them, okay, within the Jungian theory. Now that's going to seem pretty abstract off the bat, but we'll take this up as we go, and I think it will become clearer, okay? So the psychodynamic hypothesis is the idea that we are not singular unit of beings, that we have parts, and that those parts are interacting to produce our mind, right? Now, again, if it was the body, we would have no concerns about that, right? Further, if it was the brain, we'd have no concerns about that. The idea of functional localization, which is actually a bit problematic as a theory in current neuroscience, but the idea that different pieces of the brain do different things and that collectively they compose you, right, is not an especially difficult concept for people to get. And yet when it comes to the mind, people often bucket the idea. Okay, so in some ways we can look to, in fact, neuroscience to provide a certain amount of evidence and girding for this. There's a lot, actually, but we're only going to get into bits and pieces. So one of these areas is sort of split brain research. So back in the 70s, there was sort of a series of experiments. What happened was that there was a series of experimental surgical interventions which were made to try to treat people who had quite serious epileptic seizure. And so what would happen is that they'd get an epileptic seizure that would spread from one hemisphere of the brain to the other, right? If you picture the brain splits into halves, and there's a center band of connective communicative tissue called the corpus callosum that kind of connects the two halves together, okay? And so what would happen is that in these cases of epileptic seizure, one of the ways that they could forestall serious seizure spreading was they would sever the corpus callosum surgically. Basically, they would cut that band of connective tissue that bound the hemispheres together in tight communication, right? They would sever it. Now, the hemispheres would retain communication lower than that at other levels of the brain, right? But this sort of really tight, integrated communication at the corpus callosum would be severed. And the interesting thing that they started to really notice in the 70s was these people seemed mostly fine. For people who had just had like a major structure in their brain cut with a scalpel, they seemed pretty much, normal, right? High functioning. Okay. And that is, they did so until you have them in certain kinds of experimental conditions. And when you got them into those experimental conditions, what you would see is that it was almost as though each hemisphere had its own consciousness. Now, this caused a huge stir in the 70s because it's a pretty striking idea. It's something we'll talk about more, but you can go on YouTube, for instance. I think there's an interesting video with, is it John Cleese? I think it's John Cleese, the guy from Monty Python. Anyway, who's overseeing this video, but you can look, if you split brain, okay? So if you look up split brain on YouTube, you can see videos of people going through these experimental conditions where it's clear that there is a separate and distinct form of consciousness in sort of each hemisphere of the brain, right? Now, as a right-handed person, and 90% of you statistically are also right-handed because 90% of human beings are right-handed. As a right-handed person, I'm left hemisphere dominant, right? That means that most of my linguistic sense of self and so on and so forth is localized to my left hemisphere. But there is nevertheless a set of important functions about spatial material and the way that I gestalt things in the world and so on and so forth that's contained in the right hemisphere. We sometimes hear this, unfortunately oversimplified, as like, your left hemisphere is scientific and your right hemisphere is artistic. And, anyway, that's not true. And my apologies for caricaturing both scientists and artists, of which I consider myself a number of each of those populations and don't behave in either of those ways. Anyway, hemispheric localizations. So the point is that there are some real differences in the way that the hemispheres function, and people's sense of self, if they're right-handed, as 90% of the population is, tends to be localized in the left hemisphere. But nevertheless, there's a sense of self in the right hemisphere. And if you do certain kinds of experimental conditions, right, you can get it to communicate. And it thinks thoughts, it has feelings, it identifies things, right? Okay, so in the 70s that caused a really big stir. And in a way, if you think about it, that's almost necessary, right? Unless you believe that consciousness springs whole as soon as you get like exactly the right number of neurons in place, or if you believe that consciousness has nothing to do with the matter of the brain, then it stands that there's some kind of relationship there, and the relationship must be that the parts must have some measure of the ability of the whole. Well, that idea in biology extends itself into psychodynamics, that the parts that make up your mind have some mind-like properties. That you as a person are made out of things that are themselves, mental in nature, but that also partake of that quality of personhood, if not to the full extent of you. And as we get further into the course, you'll see that, sort of theoretically speaking, what I'm going to propose is that the extent to which you feel a sense of agency and integration and so on and so forth has a lot to do with how well integrated or where you're dissociated from various parts at any given time, right? And that's the sort of ebb and flow of consciousness. Sometimes we feel tightly integrated and we have high agency, we're in flow states, we feel like ourselves, and sometimes we feel adrift and disconnected, right? And everybody feels some amount of dissociation. That's a natural process, but clearly there are cases where that dissociation causes us difficulties, right? And so we'll talk about that. Okay, so that's the basics of psychodynamics sort of on the physicalist side. If you want sort of anecdotal material for psychodynamics, the best way that I typically come at that, okay, is just this. It's this expression, and odds are you have said this or something like it, okay, in the past. What was I thinking? Okay, when you have that experience, what exactly is going on? Well, it might mean a few things. It might mean that you had one state of mind, right? And then you had a radically different state of mind. And from the second state of mind, whatever you did in the first state of mind seems to be highly irrational or foolish or, right, based on some misunderstanding. What was I thinking? Why would I do that, right? Okay, so that's one version. You might have had one state and then another. It can also sometimes mean that you are sort of two minds, as we say. And what does that mean? Well, it's like when you're highly ambivalent, right? This, but also this, right? That state of ambivalence, of not knowing which way to go and feeling like you're pulled in two directions, is a very common state. And it's extremely unpleasant and difficult, right? So not knowing if you should stay in a situation or leave it. Not knowing if you should be with this person or that person. Not knowing if you should pick this road or that road. That's something that people experience a lot. Now, if you think about it, if we were singular unitive beings, right, then ambivalence is sort of hard to make sense of. How is it that we're being sort of pulled in two directions? How do we have two strong contradictory feelings? Like, at some level, that implies that there must be, right, somewhere in the unity, two parts, right, that are pulling in different directions or at cross purposes with each other. But if you think about it, your own experience and the experience of people you know are sort of full of these instances where we are of two minds. And, right, what was I thinking? I chose this, but now this, and right? And if you think about it, those are really tortured experiences for us a lot of the time. They're extremely difficult, right? And some people experience that stuff broadly and often out of proportion to the stimulus, right? There are people who get ripped up choosing dessert, and that's something we'll talk about a bit later as well. Okay, so that experience, what was I thinking, right, is a kind of experience of, having our mind move in one direction and then having it do something radically other. Some of us may have a more extreme version of this experience if you've ever had a dissociative state, and most of you have at some level. But if you've ever had a dissociative state, you may have like, geez, I don't remember that at all, right? Or like, I kind of remember that, but I don't know what state of mind I was in, sort of thing. Strong emotions, in fact, often fall into this category in and of themselves, right? We do or say or think or feel in certain ways, and then later when we're not in that state, we're like, right? This is why I advise people just don't ever, ever, ever send a text when you're experiencing a strong emotion, unless that emotion is love, and you already know that the person that you're sending it to knows that you love them, and that's like a known quantity and it's okay. Otherwise, if you're experiencing a strong emotion, don't send a text. Why? If you are angry and you send a text, you are not aware of the distortion that the anger is putting over what you write. You may think that you're sending the most measured text in the world, choosing all my words really carefully so that I'm not angry. And then you look at it a few hours later or the next day and you're like, oh my God, like this so obviously is like heated, right? What was I thinking? So there is a certain amount of split just there if you want to think about that kind of psychodynamics. Another thing you can think about that's just sort of an on the ground, an anecdotal example, as it were, is you can consider the fact of, the way that you act and the way that you feel in different contexts. So I basically guarantee you that you're a very different person with your, say, friends than you are with your grandparents. That you are different with your boss than you are with your relationships, right? Like, these are bound to be quite different experiences, right? If we were in the school physically at this point, I would reference something about sort of university persona, because that's a specific thing in and of itself, right? But the point is, like, think about it. The person you are with your friends and the person you are with your grandparents is probably pretty different. Some of you, it might be the same. And some of you might say, no, I'm the same in every context. I doubt that, for one thing. But also, in some cases, is that even appropriate, right? It seems like there are certain kinds of behaviors and modes of being that are only appropriate in certain circumstances, and it would be blurry to carry them into every circumstance. But this isn't just about modes of behavior. It isn't just about the way that we act. It's also about the way that those rules make us feel, right? So, it's just been the summer, and of course we're, mid-pandemic lockdown, so lots of people are, either have spent time at their family home or they're at their family home again. And often, in many cases, they have previously moved away and now they're back, right? That's an extremely common circumstance right now. And many of you will be finding that you are falling back into these patterns of behavior. It's not just that the environment of the home treats you in a certain kind of way. It's also that you behave accordingly. You go back into your teenage bedroom, and all of a sudden you find yourself thinking sort of teenage thoughts and having teenage emotions in a way. You may be more prone to certain kinds of outbursts and things, right? That's very widely reported, right? That the context primes you. And you can, of course, point outside and say it's because they treat me like a child, right? But it's not just that. If you check in with yourself, often it's the case that you'll note that your feelings and the way you yourself feel is very different, right? It's very different. The joke that I often make, so my long involvement with the Buddhist psychology program, the joke that I often make in this context, and if I'm teaching meditation and things, right, is if you think you've reached enlightenment, spend the weekend with your family. And inevitably that elicits a certain amount of dark laughter, right? Because people recognize what it is that I mean. You go to your 10-day Vipassana retreat and you're like, finally I've transcended my whatever. And then you go home for Thanksgiving weekend and you're like, oh my God, I'm going to murder my brother, right? I'm going to murder my mom. I'd like to choke my dad out over the gravy. And these old patterns assert themselves. The point is, right, that again, we are in a sense of two minds. We're of multiple minds. There's more than one person running inside here. We are not singular unit of beings. Okay, the last example that I'll give here, partly in the interest of time, is one that I think you'll see is sort of especially relevant, okay, to the general context when we're talking about Jung, and that's talking about dream, okay? So, as you'll see, I don't think dreams are especially super duper special or magical or anything relative to other altered states, okay? I think that, and those of you who have taken my half course know that I spend about a third of the course talking about altered states, maybe more, half, talking about altered states as a way of, right, different kinds of altered states and how those things relate to getting an understanding of one's own unconscious material and psychodynamics. However, dreams are an altered state that we all enter every single time we sleep, right? So it's easy to access, and, basically there isn't a hangover. It's recuperative, right? So, okay, and lots of you are going to have different takes on dreams. I mean, this is always the case, right? There's always sort of a demographic breakdown. So some people in the class will have 3 wild dreams a night, and they'll be lucid dreamers, and they'll remember all their dreams, and their dreams will be ultra baroque and whatever. Some people will have the occasional breakthrough dream, but otherwise not pick up much. Some people will remember a fair number of their dreams, but those dreams will be curiously mundane. They'll dream about going to work or eating cereal or whatever. And then some people will have some variation of, I don't remember many dreams, or I don't dream. For that last category, I will just say that, we can't know for sure, but, our best current science indicates you do in fact dream. The question is not whether or not you're dreaming, because if you weren't dreaming, if you didn't have some REM sleep, rapid eye movement sleep, you would die. You would go into a massive metabolic crash after about 2 weeks. That seems to be the evidence. Creatures who are deprived of REM sleep die. So you need to dream to live. The question is a question of recall. And actually, when we do, sort of more of the stuff on dreams, I'll offer some sort of techniques and things for improving your dream recall, improving dream access. But anyway, suffice it to say, you are dreaming even if you're not recalling. The point is that most people, even if they don't dream often, have some recollection of dream, even if it's childhood dreams. Children disproportionately experience nightmares, so people may remember some nightmares from when they're younger, this kind of thing, right? But the point is, odds are, you remember some dreams. Okay, so let's think about this for a second. So you have a dream. And in a dream, right, a dream is a kind of sensory experience in a way, right, simulated. It's like you're in a place, you're talking to people, there's a situation, right, usually, right? So it's like, I dreamt I was at my Aunt Hetty's farmhouse, and we went out to the barn, but it wasn't really a barn, it was more of an airplane hangar. And instead of, where she would normally have the milking machine, instead there was this statue made of butter, and it was shaped like an airplane. And I stood by it and I said, everybody keeps putting so much butter on their pasta, but I am just having mine dry. And she laughed and said, yep, the celery's really coming in this year. Okay, dream. It was not a particularly good dream. But here's my point. Everybody can recognize that strange categorical blurring, okay, which occurs within dreaming. But the question that people, often come to around this is like, is it meaningful? What do dreams mean? People want them to predict the future. As you'll see, metaphysical agnosticism will serve well in that respect. Okay? But more to the point, the question is like, are they just meaningless garbage? Are they gibberish? Are they noise? Now, I'm going to propose a series of arguments to you over the course of the year that they are not noise, that they're meaningfully structured. Okay? One of those arguments is that people have repeated dreams, right? And repetition is the opposite of noise. Like, this is just straight information theory. If you get repetition, that's signal, typically, right? Pattern, right? So you'll get repetition, and that to me indicates they're not noise. So let's for a second just assume, that they're not pure noise, that they're not pure garbage. But the question that people very seldom ask, okay, is, when I talk to Aunt Hetty in my dream, who am I talking to? Like, who's talking? And unless you believe, okay, as some people do, but unless you believe that that dreams are like your mind flying into another dimension or something, presumably you don't think you're talking to your actual Aunt Hetty, right? So who are you talking to? And the answer is you're talking to yourself, right? But you're not just talking to yourself. You didn't plan consciously the elements of this dream, right? It's an important factor. You didn't plan Aunt Hetty. You didn't plan the farm. You didn't plan the butter sculpture. You didn't consciously go, and now I'm doing this and now I'm doing that. It was presented to you, right? By what? What's presenting that to you? What plays Aunt Hetty? Where, right? Where is the language and stuff coming from? Well, the short answer is you're interacting with your own mind. But that opens up a much deeper rabbit hole than you might expect, right? So if you just think about that and let yourself sit in the weirdness, and when we get to the material on lucid dreaming, I think you'll find that it's even weirder than you might imagine, right? The point is that, like, you're interacting with a part of yourself that puts on this drama for you, right? That plays these roles. But the point is that it's autonomous from your regular consciousness, and that